Okay, everyone, before we officially kick off, as you notice, this meeting is being recorded. So if you would not like your image or your voice recorded, please ensure that your camera is off and that you continue to be muted. Let's go ahead and officially kick this off. First of all, thank you so much for being here to join the Heinz College Public Policy Lecture Series on the deep divisions among U.S. public in the views of the election process. My name is Gladys Perez-Siepersert, and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Management Programs at the Heinz College. And it's my pleasure to introduce today Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of, hello, Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at Pew Research Center. He leads planning of the center's research agenda on international demographic trends, international migration, U.S. immigration trends, and the U.S. Latino community. Mark is co-author of The Future of the First Amendment and has contributed chapters to several books about voting. Mark received his doctorate in economics from Princeton University. He frequently appears in national and international media. In fact, I recently saw him on television on Habla Now, HBO's award-winning Habla series. Without further ado, Mark Hugo Lopez.
Great, thank you, Gladys. That's really a wonderful introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be back at Carnegie Mellon speaking about the work of the Pew Research Center. I have a presentation that's going to share with you some findings from our recent surveys about the election. I'm going to talk a little bit about the election itself and who registered voters are supporting, but also a little bit about how the US public sees the election process this year. I look forward to questions that you all might have. And of course, all of this is available on the Pew Research Center's website. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So here we go. I apologize if there's a mistake or two here, but hopefully I'm not sharing something I shouldn't be sharing. So let's see. Great. So it looks like we're set, right, Gladys? I think we're good. Yes?
Yes, we are good.
Excellent, excellent. So let's get started. So first, about the Pew Research Center. The Pew Research Center is based in Washington, D.C. We are a nonprofit organization. We actually call ourselves a fact tank, which is on purpose because we don't take any positions on policy or make recommendations to candidates. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind here, is that we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. The bread and butter of the center is to conduct public opinion surveys. So of course, we want to ask questions that are relevant to the public and relevant to policymakers. And our hope is that our work is useful and relevant. So keep that in mind as I'm talking through these findings, partly because there may be some questions that you have about what should be done or how to address a particular problem, and I may not be able to answer those, but I will try to provide some important context given the work that we have produced at the Pew Research Center. So first, let's talk about Trump, Biden, and the election and where the public stands. So when you take a look at if you ask registered voters who would they vote for if the election were held today, this is our most recent read of what would be called the horse race question, which is who are registered voters going to vote for? And as you can see, 52% of US registered voters say that they're supporting Biden, another 42% say that they are supporting Trump, and you can see that other third-party candidates are also supported and identified in our question. What is interesting here is that you can see that support for Trump is generally stronger among his supporters than it is for Biden. And this has been a pattern we've seen throughout the election cycle, but also interestingly, a lot of these voters, whether they're supporting Biden or supporting Trump, are not going to change their mind. The share who say that they're going to change their mind if they're supporting Biden or Trump is relatively small. So a lot of interesting support dynamics and differences here when it comes to supporting the candidates. What's also interesting here is, what is this vote about? So are people voting against Trump, or are they voting for Biden, say among Biden supporters? And you can see here that about 63% of US registered voters who say they're voting for Biden say that their vote is a vote against Trump. So the choice is more of a vote against Trump for them than support for Biden. Interestingly, among Trump supporters, most of them say that their support is for Trump. So it's more of a vote in support of Trump than a vote against Biden. Now, of course, one of the big questions that's been happening in this election cycle is, how does the public feel about some potential outcomes with regards to who might win this coming election cycle? And one of the interesting things here is that among Biden supporters, you see a growing share, at least compared to 2016, who say that they would be either they would be disappointed, for example, if, for example, or angry, I'm sorry, if, for example, Trump happened to win. So when you take a look at this, it looks like particularly Democrats are somewhat changing in their viewpoint about how angry they would be should Trump win re-election in this coming election. Some other interesting things here. Both Trump and Biden supporters say if the other wins, that would cause lasting harm to the country. This is really, again, an indication of the polarization of the nation's electorate. And this is a trend that we've been seeing for the last 20 plus years in polling at the Pew Research Center, that the public has become more polarized. And you can see this in this particular set of findings here among Trump supporters and Biden supporters and how they see a win by the other candidate. Both 90% or so of both groups say that that would be bad for the country. It would lead to lasting harm to the US if the other candidate were to win. What does support look like for the candidates across different demographic groups? This election cycle, this has been the big set of questions that I keep getting about this election cycle. Who's going to support whom? And really, it is a story about demographics in many ways. And there have been some interesting stories around demographics that I'll talk about in just a little bit. But as you can see, there are some very strong demographic stories, particularly around gender and particularly around race and ethnicity and age, that really show some patterns to who is supporting which candidate. So for example, you've probably heard a lot of stories this year about the growing divide between men and women in their support for Donald Trump. Men are more likely to support Donald Trump than women, and women are more likely to support Biden than men. And this is a pattern that we see among blacks, Hispanics, and other groups of Americans as well. Particularly interesting among black voters, there's been a growing number of stories that are highlighting the share of black men who are supporting Trump. But I want to be clear, Biden is winning the black male vote. There's no doubt about that. But the share of black men who are voters who say they're going to support Biden is lower than it is among black women. Among Hispanics, the gap is perhaps a little bit wider, but here a similar pattern of Hispanic men more likely to lean towards Trump than Hispanic women, but in both cases, Biden is ahead with both demographic groups. In terms of youth, you can see that younger Americans are more likely to support Biden, older Americans are more likely to support Trump, and there is a real education pattern among voters, something that's becoming stronger and stronger over the course of the last few years. Those with a college degree are more likely to support Biden. Those with less than a college degree are more likely to support Trump. And you can see that here just even among whites, particularly those with no college degree, 60% tell us that they would vote for Donald Trump if the election were held today, whereas 58% of those with a college degree say that they would support Biden. So this is just some examples of some of the demographic differences in support for the candidates in this year's election cycle. Also, there's a lot of differences between different groups of voters, depending on who they're supporting, on a number of issues. So for example, when it comes to saying how important different issues are to them in this year's election cycle, Biden supporters are more likely to say healthcare is important to them than Trump supporters. And when it comes to the coronavirus outbreak, Biden supporters are more likely to say that's important to their vote this year compared with Trump supporters. Interestingly, on the economy, Trump supporters are more likely to say that's important to their vote this year than among Biden supporters, though majorities of both say that that's important for determining their vote in the 2020 presidential election. In terms of which candidate the registered voters say would be better when it comes to dealing with some particular issues, Biden has an advantage in a number of different areas. Everything from bringing the country closer together, handling the coronavirus, the impact of the coronavirus, making good decisions about foreign policy, selecting good nominees for the Supreme Court, and effectively handling law enforcement and criminal justice issues. On all of these, Biden has an advantage, with the biggest advantage being among when it comes to bringing the country closer together. On economic decisions, and this is something that many other polls around during this election cycle from other organizations have shown too, when it comes to making good decisions about economic policy, this is where Donald Trump either is at least doing as well as Biden, as you can see in our survey here, or in some other polls has shown more of an advantage for Trump than for Biden. And that's interesting because over the last 4 years, the economy was doing well up until January of this year. Starting in February, you start to see a downturn as the US economy took a hit from the coronavirus outbreak and the policies of closing many economic activities that happened in many states around the country. But the economy has also started to bounce back some as the unemployment rate has started to recover, though it hasn't made full progress back to where it was back in January. On terms of issues like race and immigration and gender, this is where we see some of the biggest divides between Trump supporters and Biden supporters. And you can really see this here in everything from race to the views of immigrants to views on Islam and also views on gender. In all cases, there's a wide divide between Biden supporters and Trump supporters on just about all of these questions that we asked about in a recent survey of the US public. So all that said, how do people feel about the upcoming election? Are they going to turn out to vote? And also, what are some of their concerns around the election process this year? As you know, there have been a lot of changes this year in terms of the way the election is administered. In many states, you could vote early, or you could vote by ballot, by mail-in ballot, or absentee ballot. So there's been a lot of controversy as well about the integrity of the process, with the president raising questions about whether or not there's fraud with regards to mail-in balloting. Now, what does the US public think about all of this? Well, first, there's a lot of interest in this election. You can see that whether somebody's a Trump supporter or a Biden supporter, there's the public is giving a lot of thought to the candidates, saying that it really matters who wins, and are extremely motivated to vote. So lots of interest in this election, according to our surveys, and this is, I think, important to note because it's somewhat a little higher than it was back in 2016, for example. What about how they plan to vote? This is one of the interesting patterns that we've noticed in the survey data that we've collected recently about how people are going to turn out to vote. And Trump supporters are more likely to say they're going to vote in person on election day. In fact, half of them say that that's what they're going to do. Among those who are going to vote for Biden, 51% say that they're going to do so by absentee or mail-in ballot. So there really is a difference in how people are going to vote, oftentimes tied to people's concerns about safety around COVID-19 and going to the polls. But interestingly, there is a divide in the share of Trump supporters or Biden supporters who say they're going to vote on election day versus those who say they're going to vote by absentee or mail-in ballot. There are also, when it comes to different aspects of the voting process, there are some differences between Biden supporters and Trump supporters in their confidence in the election process. So for example, how confident are each group in terms of whether or not something will happen with regards to the November election? That is that in-person polling places, sorry, that's hard to say, in-person polling places will be run safely without spreading the coronavirus. Trump supporters are more likely to say that than Biden supporters, though majorities of both say that they expect that to be the case, or confident that that's going to happen. What about knowing who won the election within a day or two of election day? Only about half of both groups say that they expect to know the outcome of the election within 2 days of the election. What about it will be clear who won the election after all votes are counted? Biden supporters are more likely to say this will be the case, 76% compared with 55% of Trump supporters. And what about ballots sent in by mail will be delivered in time to be counted? Biden supporters are more likely to say they're confident this will happen than is the case for Trump supporters. Oftentimes, these results here reflect what we see from the previous slide about how people are going to turn out to vote. I think there's some reflection of both, a combination of these two patterns. What about confidence in whether or not that votes cast across the U.S. will be counted as voters intended? So it's not only will they be counted, but will they actually reflect the vote that people made on their ballot? And here you can see that strong Trump supporters are least likely to express confidence that mail-in ballots will be counted fairly. But you can also see that there are some pretty strong patterns here among Biden supporters in absentee and mail-in ballots being counted as voters intended. Also, we did ask about whether or not voters say it's important to learn the results of this election quickly. Is it important to know right away that the election's results are that we know the results from election day? And you can see that among all voters, 82% say that it's very or somewhat important that that happen. This is particularly true among Trump supporters, but Biden supporters are also in the majority when they say that it's important that we know who won the election within a day or two of election day. Only half, though, of both groups say that they're confident that this is going to actually happen. I'm going to stop there. That's a lot of data. I'm happy to answer any other questions about what you saw in these findings. You can find our work at pewresearch.org, and you can certainly follow us on a whole bunch of different social media platforms. And you can find my information here at mlopez@pewresearch.org if you wanted to email me, or Hugo Lopez on Twitter. So I'm going to stop there. I look forward to our conversation. Let me stop my share. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for all of your insights. So essentially, if you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat, and I will then ask Mark. So I'll give people some time to think about it, but I'll give you the first question, Mark. So in your analysis, did you ask about people's intention to go out and actually vote on election day, whether mail-in or in person? You asked about their perception, about what they would do, but to actually go out and get out the vote.
Yes, among registered voters, 90% plus say that they are planning to vote this year, or in our survey had already done so. So with so much early voting, many folks have already told us that they've already cast a ballot. In fact, some of the latest numbers I've heard suggest that something on the order of nearly 60 million Americans have already cast a ballot in this year's election. That makes a lot of sense given the concern around the COVID-19 virus, and also the options to vote at different times that are much more extensive this year than were the case, say, in 2016. But I would also say, notably, some states like Oregon were already doing mail-in voting. They've been doing it for a few election cycles now. So not every place is new to this, but many states, including my own Maryland, have made it easier to vote by mail this year.
Got it. Okay, so we have a question here about what surprised you, Mark, the most, or what surprised you the most about the findings from Pew's election polling in 2020 compared to previous presidential elections?
Well, we've been tracking a lot of what you see here over the years, and there isn't anything surprising from these findings because we've been slowly kind of getting to many of these points over time. The country has become more polarized. We've noted over the course of several election cycles that is gradually becoming more and more polarized. That is happening in everything from, like what you saw here, on issues, different viewpoints on a number of issues, but also even in the friends people have and the places that they live. We've found, for example, that today Democrats are more likely to live in communities where there are other Democrats and their friends are largely Democrats. And the same thing is true for Republicans. They tend to be more likely to live and have friends who are Republican, which means that there is less of this engaging with people who might have a different point of view than you, both in your daily life or in your circle of friends. That's something that's notable over the last 10, 15 years that we've been tracking at Pew Research.
Interesting. So another question is, what kind of geographic or state differences do you see?
So the center doesn't do a lot of focus on states because our surveys are national in scope. But we do take a look at battleground states versus non-battleground states. And you do see the race is closer in battleground states in the horse race question. So the public is split between Biden and Trump among registered voters in battleground states compared to non-battleground states. But also, interestingly, you do see some differences in intent to vote, when to vote in battleground states compared to non-battleground states. Those who live in battlegrounds are more likely to say they're going to turn out to vote. Makes sense because that's where a lot of the effort from nonpartisan organizations to get out the vote and the candidates themselves to get out the vote is happening. It's in the battleground states.
Did you notice any new battleground states that we haven't seen in other elections?
Yes, so the Pew Research Center, when identifying battleground states, turns to a lot of other organizations to see who they're identifying as potential battlegrounds. It sort of takes a look at all of them, and we take a somewhat conservative view on sort of how extensive that is. It's not necessarily the long list that you might see some organizations have, but what we tend to identify this year as new battlegrounds are Arizona, for example, and Georgia. Those are two big ones that are new battlegrounds that haven't traditionally been battlegrounds before. I would point to, though, that Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, particularly Pennsylvania, but Florida remain, and North Carolina remain battlegrounds, and they've been battlegrounds for many years in a row now, or many election cycles in a row. But Arizona and Georgia, and possibly even Texas, are new to the list of battleground states.
Question about the scope of the poll. How many people were surveyed? What were the percentages for party association?
So our survey is part of what we call our America Trends panel. We surveyed over 10,000 Americans online, and these are people who we've recruited to be part of our panel. We do a regular adjustment and update to our samples, so we're recruiting new people all the time, but particularly there's a period where we do this over the course of the spring and summer to refresh the sample. So the sample is 10,000 plus Americans. I want to say for this particular survey, it was 11,000 interviews, and it is national in scope, so it is representative of the US public nationally. And I forget what the other part of the question was. There was one other part to the question.
What were the percentages for party association?
So the party association percentages reflect the party association percentages you generally see across the country. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but it does vary from survey to survey. But I want to say there are more Democrats than Republicans, but a large number who are independent, but say they lean towards one party or the other. And we do not wait, by the way, to party ID. We just take the survey, whatever those shares happen to be. We wait to gender and age and education and immigrant status, but we don't wait to political party ID.
Got it. And is it historically the case that when there's an incumbent, voters are motivated to vote either against or for the incumbent rather than to the challenger, as in the case this year?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think that oftentimes this year, much of the analysis gets characterized as this is something new. It's against Trump. Trump has brought a bunch of new trends to, or new elements to the election. But as the questioner has noted, yeah, this is something that you see happen a lot in previous elections. It's not unique to this election. And there's a lot of trends that we see for this election cycle that we've seen before. So there are many elements that are not new. I will say, though, it does also depend on the candidate. So a candidate, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but a candidate who is a challenger and has a well-defined set of policies or is well-known might be somebody who is perhaps less a vote against the incumbent than you might be seeing this year, for example.
So another question here. It seems like the polls today are similar to what the polls stated leading up to the 2016 election. Can you speak to why the polls estimated the outcome in 2016 incorrectly? And if there is anything to show if that could be the case this year as well? Basically, is there a reason to expect that President Trump will outperform the polls? And
great.
has the process changed in the last few years to estimate this differently?
So there are two polls that one should be, when one thinks about the answer to this question, there are two polls one should be thinking about. National polls, which is what the Pew Research Center does, and state level polls, which is where a lot of the analysis around the Electoral College and who's going to win the Electoral College generally comes from. In terms of Pew Research Center and other national polls, the national polls in 2016 got the presidential vote correct. We were showing Hillary Clinton would win, and she did win the national vote. However, it's the state level polls that had a number of challenges in 2016. If you're interested in an analysis of this, the American Association for Public Opinion Research, or APOR, published a report in 2017, an analysis of 2016 polling in both the state and the national levels. At the state level, one of the challenges was that many state level polls, for example, didn't weight to education. And many state level polls also are not transparent. So it's sometimes hard to tell what those state level polls, who they surveyed and how they were conducted, because there isn't a lot of transparency, partly because many of those are conducted by private companies or pollsters who have proprietary, want to protect their proprietary methods and so forth. This year, it does appear that there have been some changes, though not entirely at the state level. Many more pollsters are weighting to education, which is one of the challenges that there was back in 2016. But I think it still remains to be seen where we will be with regards to how well the state polls did and the national polls as well post-election. There are a number of indicators, though, that this year is a little bit different. For example, Biden does have a larger lead this year than Clinton did after the last debate. So there is a possibility that there could be an overperformance of Trump, but it remains to be seen if that will be enough to overtake the current gap in polling that nationally we see in terms of Biden's advantage. One other thing that I would say that's important to note here is that it's going to be hard to know how different subgroups voted in different states, because the exit polls this year, and there were 2 of them this year, may have a challenge given the shifts in the way in which the public is voting, that it's voting a lot earlier. And it really isn't truly an exit poll like we've seen in the past, because of so much early voting or absentee voting. So there are a number of question marks about how well polling is done as an industry this year. It remains to be seen what ultimately we'll find out. But there are a lot of really good questions here. But I would say there have also been some changes, some improvements in the way polling is done, though, again, it remains to be seen where we will be.
Thank you. So a question about, can you elaborate on how Pew conducts the polling? For example, how it's adjusted for the decline in landlines?
So this is an online poll. It is not a telephone poll. So to adjust for the decline in response rates to landline telephone surveys, we shifted many years ago to an online panel. The Pew Research Center built its own online panel, and as I noted earlier, we are always refreshing it, particularly for groups that are underrepresented in our panel, groups that tend to be, for example, younger, male, and Hispanic or Black. Those are groups that we oftentimes have a focus on refreshing the sample for to ensure the representation in the panel. But this is an online panel. It is not a telephone survey, and we have, again, been doing online panels now for 6 years.
Okay, question about, do different demographics have different response rates, and how do you account for this? Is there a deep sea of hidden Trump supporters or Trump voters?
That's a great question. It remains to be seen. The best we can do is to wait to existing Census Bureau data around age, gender, location in the country, education. Those are all parameters that we weight our data to, and we follow that same process every time. There may be some switches in terms of Trump voters or people who are currently undecided and may shift towards Trump. But most of folks who've said that they're going to support one candidate or the other are locked in on their vote, as you could see from some of our polling a little bit earlier.
This question is about the Hispanic vote, and whether using the term holistically is generalizing across, Hispanics in California or Arizona or Texas, where there may be different priorities.
This is also a really great question, and it's been one of the questions that I have been receiving a lot this year as I respond to the press about the Latino vote. One of the ways in which reporters have characterized this is asking the very question of, is there even such a thing as the Latino vote? There's been a lot of realization this year that the Latino vote that Donald Trump has maybe about 30% or so of the Latino vote. Many national surveys show this, and some state surveys, like in Florida, show an even higher level of support for Donald Trump. But it's not much different than it was in 2016, and not much different from what Romney or John McCain won in 2012 or 2008, for example, for the Latino vote. But the Latino vote is diverse, and it varies, and there are many different elements to it. Like, for example, evangelical Latino voters tend to lean more towards the Republican Party. You'll find that college-educated Latinos tend to lean more towards the Democratic Party. There's a different story for the state of Florida, which has a large Cuban vote, and also a growing Venezuelan, though still very small vote, both of which lean towards the Republican Party. But then Puerto Ricans in the state also tend to lean more towards the Democratic Party. But you also see patterns in places like Texas, which is different than a state like Nevada or Colorado. So when we talk about the Latino vote, there are different issues that motivate that vote, but also different patterns to identification with the parties across the states.
Makes sense. So can you talk about, the data on the effects of the rising polarization on American support for socialism or socialist policies?
That's interesting. So we do see somewhat of a division on some progressive policies. For example, Democrats are more likely to support a larger government providing more services than, say, Republicans are. But there also is support among both Democrats and Republicans for example, raising the minimum wage. So it does depend on the issue that we're talking about. But directly asking about views of socialism and views of capitalism, the US public has become somewhat less positive about capitalism and somewhat more positive about socialism. And that is also true across young people, no matter their political party, even though there may be some differences by Democrats and Republicans among young people on those measures.
This question is just about the process, and if you've polled on just how folks feel about the Electoral College or ranked choice voting.
I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, so I'm sorry I can't quite answer that directly. But we have asked about this before, and the public is somewhat mixed in its support for the Electoral College, and it's not changed much. But what I don't remember is the patterns by Democrats and Republicans. But I want to say that both were largely not in support of the Electoral College, though it depends on the year and who the different candidates are and president is at the time.
This question is about the integrity of the voting. So, is Pew accounting for a response where someone intends to vote a certain way, but then due to potentially voter suppression or incorrect mail-in ballots, were unable to vote or have their votes thrown out?
So we do ask people about how confident they feel about their vote being counted, as you saw some of the results earlier. And we also do ask people whether or not they think it's going to be easy to cast a vote this year. I didn't share those findings, but Black and Hispanic voters are less likely to say it's going to be easy to vote this year. We do a follow-up survey, a post-election survey, and in fact, we have several in the works and plans that will ask people about how the voting process went. And in the past, some people are more likely to say they have to wait longer in line. It depends on where they live, but also Black voters and Hispanic voters, particularly in past elections, have told us that they have to wait longer to cast their vote or wait in long lines. So there are some patterns to people's experiences around the election, and that's something we're going to be following this year.
So here's a question about Pew's process. How does Pew recruit people into the panel, especially because active recruitment implies that there's a sample, that the sample is not a random sample? Does the weighing for education and race and age, et cetera, ensure that your panel is representative of the population as a whole?
So the way we do our recruitment is we use what's called address-based sampling. So that is a random selection of addresses around the country, and we send a paper invitation. So there's an envelope invitation that goes to people to invite them to be a part of the panel. Now, people have to choose to be a part of the panel. Just because you get the invitation doesn't mean you're gonna join in. But that's where we try to then do some targeted address-based recruitment to try to find people from some of the harder to reach groups to invite them to be a part of the panel. Now, what's interesting is when you go from being telephone or random digit dial to being online using an address-based sample, it is interesting that there are still some interesting patterns here. That is that a lot of people who like to volunteer also like to volunteer to be part of surveys. So one of the challenges is to get people who are perhaps less likely to volunteer to be in a survey to be a part of the panel. We do some weighting to adjust for volunteering. We actually ask whether or not people have like to volunteer or not, and that's something that we adjust for as a weight when we do our weighting of our analysis.
I don't see other questions in the chat, but I'll ask a question, Mark, in case I give people some more time. You noted that something striking this year compared to the last election was the rise of polarization. Can you speak to how that shakes out, gender or demographic wise? Do certain groups feel it more than others?
Oh, that's interesting. So a lot of the polarization is happening among white voters, though it is happening among all groups of Americans. It just depends on the question we might be looking at, but broadly speaking, white voters particularly have become more polarized, particularly around the lines of education and the places that they live. You can just see it in the big states. A state like California, New York tends to be very Democrat leaning, but a state like, say, Tennessee tends to be more Republican leaning. So a little bit of that geography story again. But even among Latinos, we do see some polarization, as I was talking about earlier, around gender. You also see some polarization just in Republican Democrats. We've noticed in our Hispanic surveys that there's been a widening gap between Hispanic Democrats and Hispanic Republicans on a number of issues, just like you see among the general public, suggesting that there's even political polarization within the Hispanic population.
Well, I don't see other questions. So any closing thoughts for us, Mark?
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how the election goes. I hope everybody has had a chance to vote and to participate. But I'm really looking forward to seeing where things go this year. It's going to be an interesting year, and I have a feeling that I'm going to be busy for the next 2 months. Not that I haven't been busy. It's been a busy few months up to this, but I think it's going to be a busy couple of months afterwards.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and these insights. Mark, thank you for your time.
Thank you, folks. I look forward to any questions you might have. Feel free to shoot me an email.
Thank you. Lots of in the chat for you. Bye.
Bye.